Hey, John.
Hello, greetings.
Hey, Marco.
Hi, Michael.
Sound check. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I can hear you now.
How's it floating, Marco?
It's good. I think I'm ready.
Ready, Freddie. Let's go.
Okay. This is called, what is this? Ancient Philosophy and
The mystery.
Senses.
Yeah.
I came up with that title. I actually wanted to edit it and just rename this Ecstasy. And I'm really, wherever you guys want to go with this, but I thought it'd be a nice idea if we do a clean start. I got this inspiration from you, Michael, because I don't know Ben Kingsley. No, not Ben Kingsley. I do know Ben Kingsley. He's an actor. Who's this guy we're reading?
Peter.
Peter Kingsley.
Peter Kingsley. I have but I did read his book this weekend. A very short essay. So I do have some familiarity with him. And a very close friend of mine borrowed Reality from my library. He saw it on the shelf and said, "Oh, can I borrow that?" I said, "Sure." So I'm looking for when he finishes it, I'm going to start it because I did start it, but I wasn't able to finish it. So that's the little bit that I know about this author so far. So
Yeah.
where would you?
The only thing I know is through that article that we posted. I just recently did get his book, and I've read about almost 100 pages of Reality. So,
Oh, you have? Okay.
yeah.
That's about how far I've read as well. And that book was gifted to me earlier this year by Brian George, who is an author we've published on metapsychosis.
Yeah, that's right.
We're working on a manuscript with him. He, in his manuscript, draws on ancient texts and fragments, and in a way does something in fiction or poetry like Kingsley, I think, is trying to do in his book Reality, as well as in these interviews that we've said, which is to remove the cruft of intellectual history from these particular figures who are seen as seminal in the Western philosophical tradition, and point to what they were really saying. And he has a radical idea of what they're really about that's at odds, or at least he paints it as being at odds with the tradition. So I think that that's interesting. And there's a freshness in his voice.
Yeah.
There's something I feel that's grounded or realized, I think, in his voice. I think that he's not coming at it as an academic or as a matter of intellectual exercise. It goes a lot deeper than that. And I think what he's pointing to is a mostly neglected dimension of our tradition, which, if we were able to attune with it, might give us some other paths of thinking, as Parmenides.
Yeah, I consider. I hope this is a working phrase. A practicing scholar in a way. He's actually practiced what he's been reading about these people, and yeah, I get it. I get a really strong vibe from reading him that resonates with my own personal experience in a lot of ways.
I was struck by something he says in the interview about consciously using all your senses at the same time. As you move from sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, in between there is a void. I couldn't remember if he said blackness or blankness, but it's that void that if you get really attuned and skillful, you can slip through into eternity. So he's talking about the relationship between the senses, which are mysterious, and how we can use our imaginations, skillfully and unskillfully, to overlay upon our environments. Now we can do this egoically, or we can do it in collaboration with, I believe, these other worlds. I was struck by, I don't know why you responded. I don't know if you saw our last conversation, Michael.
Yes, I did.
You did. And I also saw Marco and Michael's, I saw your conversation previous to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was using this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay. And as a communique from a subtle realm, from a dream that I'd had that night that I shared with Marco. Marco also shared a subtle experience that he had had previously. And he made this gesture. Isn't this the gesture you made, that mudra?
The cosmic mudra, yes.
Is this correctly?
That's right.
Okay. I just asked, is there a relationship between this and this? Okay. I don't know if there is or is not, but I do know our minds are primed to create relationships, even when they're not there. Even if there's no relationship at all between any of this. If you say, is there a relationship between this and this and this, our minds can find them. You know, that's what we do. And this is the heart, I believe, of what storytelling is all about. So where I would like to start is inviting us to think about ecstasy. He does this in this particular book. I'm quoting him. Cultures are created and destroyed in ecstasy. And for every moment in between, there is nothing that keeps the world alive aside from the breath of ecstatics. At any given moment in time, there will only ever be one single way to put a real step forward, which is in a state of ecstasy that takes us out of ourselves. This is how it has always been and will be for each of us, and this is also how it is for the whole. We have the strange idea in the West that civilization just happens, that they come into existence as a hit or miss affair, and then we bumble along, creating and inventing and making it better. But this is not how things are done at all. Civilizations never just happen. They are brought into existence quite consciously with unbelievable compassion and determination from another world. Then the job of people experienced in ecstasy is to prepare the soil for them, carefully sow and plant them, care for them, watch them grow. But not only are these people needed to bring new worlds into existence, they even are needed to bring them to an end, so as to help make way for the new. So I think that we're in the Anthropocene, Capitalocene. I don't know how you guys how do we pronounce that, or even what this means. But drawing upon a conversation that I posted with Benita Roy on Rebel Wisdom, I'm thinking a lot about this new mind that maybe we are preparing each other for. And my feeling is that what we've been doing in these cafe conversations and other conversations here and elsewhere is creating conditions for this new mind, which will not probably be, it may be related to, but not the same as the developmental mind of the neoliberal hierarchies that teach us in school how important our IQs are taking tests. You know, that whole compulsory kind of factory model education, which all of us are aware of the downsides of this. We've all explored this pretty thoroughly in previous conversations. So this is where I believe reading Kinsley is has been very stimulating for me. This is a very lively read, very easy to read. And I'm glad I started out with an easy text like this that is very fluffy. The text is extremely fluffy, just like the passage I just read. But the notes are extensive and extremely complicated. I mean, he really does, for every footnote has half a dozen scholars, and he takes issue with them, and he shows how wrong they are, and he has proof, he claims, for how they're wrong. Plato is one that got it really wrong, he thinks. So he has a lot of scorn for Plato. But I don't know. I haven't read his larger, more philosophical works like Reality, but I'm looking forward to that. So
that's interesting about all the notes in the book you have there, because Reality doesn't have any.
wow.
And Reality doesn't refer to any other scholars. It's pure assertion. And one has to, in a way, trust the author.
This half of this book is notes. The text is very short. The rest of it is notes.
Mm-hmm.
They're very detailed. That's interesting. But he has a very oracular kind of voice.
He does. He himself sounds like he's speaking out of that stillness of being that he claims is at the heart of Western civilization and has been dissociated from appearance of being, or the appearances or sense experience. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with Plato and Aristotle. And he's, I think, offering a similar critique that others have toward the tradition, including Nietzsche and all the postmodernists. I drew a picture to.
Nice.
I didn't mean to. It just happened. You've seen this before. I'll share it. It's very simple, but it, I think, encapsulates what has occurred in that tradition. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
It's a pyramid with an eye at the top. Up here is the one, and there's an eye. Down here is the many, and it's everything else. And that's
also on a $1 bill. Did you know that?
That's also on the $1 bill. Yes, that's the.
If there's a relationship there.
I believe there is, and part of that relationship has to do with the privileging of a transcendental, abstract, purely rational other that is ultimately one. And in Plato's cosmology, it's the world of pure forms, privileging that over the world of the many, which is associated then with the senses, with what we experience through our embodied existences. And that dissociation, putting one higher, the other lower, putting one in the position of control where it's able to surveil everything and where resources must flow up to the top, becomes an expression of what we've come to experience as scientific, technological, rational civilization and the effort to control everything. And so you mentioned factory model education. Our educational system comes out of those original schools in Greece, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum. And so we're living deeply in this schism between the one and the many, which then becomes associated with other kinds of dualities, such as a being and becoming, or being and appearance, or truth and illusion. And part of what I think that Kingsley is saying is that in the beginning that separation didn't exist. That was a later imposition, actually, on the originary transmission, which he calls them great spiritual beings, Parmenides and Empedocles, were bringing forth. And they weren't just philosophers or thinkers, and certainly not rationalists. They were using logic in order to illuminate a spiritual truth, which to me, which, well, we could discuss, but it has to do with the senses and coming to our senses. So I think that that's really interesting because it's different than the ascetic and ascending type of current that wants to get away from the senses into a world of pure abstraction, a world where everything can be measured and predicted.
Like AI, like
Yeah,
a lot of AI enthusiasts. But beam me up.
it is the ultimate wet dream of the
Yeah.
of the. It's the wet dream of the extremist rationalist. I think is that ability to predict and control everything, or have some entity predict and control it. In our image.
Well, if I want to as soon as possible, but just throw my little bit in here. What attracted me to Kinsley and his essay is he was, to me, countering of opening up to the senses and knowing that they have limitations and stuff, but the more you open, then you have a better relationship that is a type of transcendence that's opening, and it's not hierarchy. It's about opening, the transcendence of opening from where you're at. And the senses being gifts of the very divine that we're trying to connect to. That's how I connected to it.
I also just want to add to that the Empedocles and Parmenides, the pre-Socratics that he draws on as the sort of architects of um, this invisible realm that makes this realm of the senses five possible, were poets.
Mm-hmm.
And he even implies sort of that it was the pre-Socratics are in this poetic vernacular. And I think that is very intriguing because there came a split, I think, probably with Plato and certainly with Aristotle, maybe less so with Aristotle, but there's this strong, Plato was definitely wanting to throw the poets out of the city. As you may recall, he saw them as a very unrigorous group of people.
and dangerous.
Yeah. And so I think that's intriguing. So his, and I don't know much about him except that I thought he opened up a lot of space in the brief encounters I had with him in the book and in the interview, and a lot of curiosity about the incantatory, the vibratory, the affective, logic, the interplay of different kinds of logic. And I think that this may not be Plato or Aristotle's fault, but for so many, thousands of years, there was the law of identity that dominated all logical thinking. And that, of course, has been deconstructed by people like Graham Priest and many others who are looking at paraconsistent logics, deviant logics, where that's called into question, that law of identity. And something that you said, Marco, talking about logic and the senses and the relationship between classical logics and the new logics that are emerging, brought to my attention something in my own, where did I put this? I hope I don't lose my track of thought. Something about surface and depth and surface structure and deep structure, and even and how the microcosm and the macrocosm, we all know this very well, mirror one another. So since we are self-similar to the world, any changes that happen in us are going to happen in the world also, and vice versa. So I think that we were aware of this, we could, I believe, and I think Kingsley is aware of this, we could do a great service to ourselves and to each other as we try to create communities that are able to drop the frameworks, the epistemological stance that has created the conditions that we're now suffering from in the Anthropocene. And be open, as I think Marco is more than myself sometimes, to the ontological. And new epistemologies will emerge, no doubt, as this as a new ontology, perhaps freed up from the classical epistemologies that have dominated so much of our thinking and our being. So anyway, I hope that's of use to us as we think about our attention and the power of our attention, as we've been doing on many of our cafes. Perception, refining our perception, making it more precise, working with the affective zones and the imagination. I believe that this has been in a spirit of collaboration. We have in many of our calls and our conferences and our study groups given our attention to the quality of our attention. My whole effort in working with clean language has been to refine our perceptual space, which I think is nightmarishly, horrifically sloppy. I mean, most of us are walking into a room that is intruded upon by all kinds of extraneous energetics that have nothing to do with our core. And so my whole thing is, and I include myself in that, because, and I believe clean language is a tool, it is a technique, it is a methodology actually, and it is sort of a philosophy of holding at bay my own projections, so that most conversations are all about you project onto me, I project onto you. At the end of the conversation, we know nothing about each other at all. This, I would say, is 99.9 of what people do when they talk. But I think there are other things going on. And I think that with a little bit of attention, the quality of our attention through a method, whatever it is, meditation practice or dream work or working with art, with music, with poetry, I think these are all different styles of synesthesia, working with the in-between of the senses. And I'll tell, just to ground this in a little bit of my pragmatic experience. I've worked with a lot of elderly people with a whole range of different kinds of geriatric complaints. So, but I found that one client, especially someone who started out as a client who became a very dear friend, she had a dementia and she had aphasia, so she could barely string a sentence together if it was coherent. But I was told whenever, by people who observed her, they said, when you're around, she's very happy. What are you doing? And they asked me, do you understand what she says? And I said, no, I don't understand what she says. It doesn't matter what I understand. I think what's important is that I catch her rhythm, and then she catches mine. So it's much more like tossing a ball back and forth. I don't know what she means. It doesn't matter. It's catching the rhythm. She's lost the code, but she can still catch the rhythm. And boy, could she dance. She could really foxtrot. This lady she moved across the dance floor like, she was just an angel when she got up, especially big band music. But I also got her it was astonishing to me that I could say something to her, like we're going to a movie, or we're going to go see a show, or, we're going out to dinner. I would write it down. I would show her the speech that I had written down. And I would say this out loud. And she could, perfectly. She could read written speech perfectly. I would hand her a piece of complex poetry, And I said, read this out loud. She could. She had a deep, rich alto voice. She could read a beautiful, complex verse. And she would often stop and make meta comments. She'd say, oh, wow, oh my God. So she was getting something. So my hypothesis here is she could catch the rhythm. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what I think is going on with as we create conditions for a new mind. That is, sure, we can work on the mind that we already got. I think that's what developmental theories are all about. And we know Kim Wilber's work, brilliant work, by the way. And there are many others who are working at the meta level, different kinds of meta. I think Bonnie Roy has done some superb work around 6 ways of going meta. It's a presentation she did recently. I think Jeremy quoted from that work, and I hope that maybe in a future Café, if we're really ready for a deep dive, we could explore it. But I'm drawing some of my my thinking from thinking about going meta and what happens when we go meta, and what kind of meta is that? And when you go meta, does that meta have a size or a shape? Where does that meta come from? So I can use clean language to go meta in many different ways. And I think that is of use and delight to possibly many of us and to future beings that we are creating their possibilities through our activities this very day and in this conversation perhaps. So anyway, I could say more, but I want to press the pause button and pick up on, receive what you guys are, what's coming up for you right now.
What's coming up for me is really valuing the place the senses and developing. It is a development because part of my understanding of what Kinsley is pointed to that I took from his reading is because of the way they've lost sight of the original intent of creating a logic to actually, my understanding, to relate to the senses and actually use them to serve the cosmos or the divine, to be a part. It's taking part, but somehow it went south, and the kind of logic that was created was more about controlling the senses. And this may, it wasn't totally wrong, because sometimes, we do. In my trauma experience, I've had to exercise control of not letting the senses overwhelming me, what's showing up. But his way of talking about finding a way to, and this, he had a phrase, and I wish I could find it, finding the stillness within the movement of whether it's your mind, your sensation, the outside world. And he goes into this, to me, the polarity between stillness and movement. And this has been really important to me. So that's where and to be living at this time that is very liminal in the largest sense of what's going to happen next on this planet. It is liminal. We've already screwed it up. We're in a liminal place of what, we don't know what's going on. But to be at this time, his kind of words and Bateson in them are just infusing me with a way of, yeah, I don't know what's happening, but that doesn't mean I can't dance, if you get my meaning. That the don't know and his teaching about stillness helps me realize, yeah, I have to sit with the don't know so I can be open to the new knowing that I think is all around us. I don't just think, I feel. It's deep in my core, as you would say, John. That I'm a particular dwelling place of everything that's happening, and I'm going to own it. That's the way I feel.
Well, I have some thoughts. Oh my God, I sound like a monster echoing. You hear that?
That may be me.
Okay.
Is that better? Okay.
They're a bit of a mess, as usual. But I want to introduce a distinction that might be interesting to play with.
Okay.
And it'll relate to poetry. I think it'll relate to ecstasy. I think it will relate to logic. And I'll see if I can tie these together. And it relates also to openness and closure. So the distinction is between allusion, spelled Allusion, and illusion, spelled beginning with an I. And what I want to suggest or get to is the idea that the mental structure, rationality, the law of identity that you referenced earlier, John, deals with illusion and distinguishing illusion from reality. And that is the mode that's appropriate to that belongs to logic, to science, to abstract thought. And it's about closure, actually, because you want to make a determination as to what's real and what's not, so that you could distinguish what is going to be of use to you, what's perhaps a threat, what to move towards, and what to move away from. And illusion is different because illusion suggests meanings in multiple directions simultaneously. It's an open statement that allows for resonances in multiple directions. It doesn't close meaning down, but it's not completely vague either. There can be, I believe, a rigor in illusion, which has to do with striking the right note. A word or a phrase in poetry which is allusive strikes a note that creates a feeling. And it also may suggest images. It may suggest other works of in poetry or in really in a tradition that makes the statement sensible. More than just being cognizable, it's sensible. And one of the things that Peter Kingsley talks about is how in Parmenides's and Empedocles' work, they use words very precisely in a way that keeps them open. And they're referring to Homeric poetry and other usages of language that would have been common at the time, but are no longer because we don't speak ancient Greek. So I think that what Plato and certainly later, because Plato was also a poet, so he was a bit of a conflicted character. But what later people become uncomfortable with, and in the split between the sciences and the arts, and between reason and the senses, is that I think illusion is a little bit messy, and much like ecstasy is messy. It's not constrained within formal rules. And when I don't know that much about ancient Greek, I'm not myself a scholar, but I've read, picked up a number of fragments. I know that one of the traditions in ancient Greece was the various cults and mystery schools and festivals that were held regularly, that were occasions for ecstasy. They were occasions for getting out of the everyday, getting out of the default mode way of perception, and experiencing a boundary dissolution, experiencing a larger reality. So the Dionysian festivals are one example of those, and I believe it's been told to me, I didn't fact check this, that the 4th of October is one of the traditional Dionysian festivals coming up. It's Thursday. And so I think that there is a relationship between poetry and ecstasy. And I believe that the subversive quality of poetry is precisely in that it points to or draws us toward ecstatic experience. And that's what I hear Kingsley communicating. And I think that there is a relationship between ecstatic experience where the senses are opened, where one is seeing, feeling, hearing, tasting, touching, knowing the other. And uh, and something like a new civilization, something like a renewal of civilization in the wake of the catastrophe of the modern world. I think part of returning to our senses, returning to a poetics of being, would mean that we have a different relationship with Earth. And that different relationship would allow for a different kind of technology, a different kind of civilization. And I think we're exploring what that might be. I think that's what's the question, one of the big questions of the moment, not just here in the cafe, but across the planet, is we need a new way forward. And how are we going to get on that path and off the path of non-being that we're currently on?
That was beautiful, Marco. Ecstasy, where senses are open and knowing the other. And the different relationship to Earth and exploring what that might be. And I just want to add, and the performing body. What kind of body is that body that can perform ecstasy? Which that ecstasy of the breathing ecstatics is what Kingsley claims keeps us all here. Those ecstatics stop breathing, we're out, it's over. So fortunately, I think there are a lot of breathing ecstatics alive and well. I'm looking at, you're talking about rigor and illusion. And this has triggered an ecstatic occasion for me. As I recall, Joni Mitchell and her song that I posted a few weeks ago in our music thread. And I just want to quote briefly, not all of it, the lyrics to both sides now. Rows and flows of angel hair and ice cream castles in the air and feather canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way. But now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way. I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from up and down, and still somehow, it's clouds' illusions I recall. I really don't know clouds at all. And moving from Joni Mitchell, a very contemporary sage singer, a brief moment, snatch of dialogue from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Antony has just lost a battle at sea with Caesar due to some Cleopatra really fucked up really badly. This really undermined his Antony's thinking was disrupted. So he responded from his heart rather than from his head. And he lost the battle. It's over. He's toast. He knows it. He's on the stage with his servant Eros. He says, Eros, thou yet beholdst me. Eros, I, noble lord. Antony, sometimes we see a cloud that's dragonish, a vapor sometime like a bear or lion, a towered citadel, a pendant rock, a forked mountain, or blue promontory with trees upon it, nod unto the world and mock our eyes with air. Thou hast seen these signs. They are black vespers pageants. Eros, I, my good lord. Antony, that which is now a horse, even with a thought, the racked its limbs, and makes it indistinct as water into water. Eros, it does, my lord. Antony, my good knave Eros, now thy captain is even such a body. Here I am Antony, yet cannot hold this visible shape, my knave. I made these wars for Egypt and the queen, whose heart I thought I had, for she had mine. She, Eros, has packed cards with Caesar, and false played my glory unto an enemy's triumph. Nay, weep not, gentle Eros. There is left us ourselves to end ourselves. I think that's pretty sublime poetry. And my feeling is, when it's all, I think Antony is, and what is the relationship between the mind of Shakespeare and the mind of Joni Mitchell? I've looked at clouds from both sides now. Win and lose and still somehow. It's clouds' illusions I recall. I really don't know clouds at all. And a child in the grass, on her back, warm sun, looking up at the clouds. Is it a camel? Is it a rabbit, bunny rabbit? Is it a mouse? It isn't as if the children who are looking at these cloud shapes and creating associations, it's not like they are being trapped in an illusion. You know? This is what the mind does. And I think it's a great blessing, actually, this interplay. This capacity to sit on your, to lie down, look up at the sky and watch the clouds go by, and to riff with the mind in the clouds. I think this is what Shakespeare is doing. I think this is what Joni Mitchell is doing. It's what we've all done on some occasions. So I have a funny feeling, and I may be wrong, but I have a funny feeling that reciting poetry out loud, we know studies that indicate that with the elderly population, reading out loud is very good for your brain mind. So it's a cognitive enhancer to read poetry out loud. And I believe that we already have what we need. I mean, we have poetry, we have dance, we have drama, we have theater, we have philosophy, we have history. We have all of these different disciplines and many brilliant practitioners. And I believe we just have to figure out a way of tuning into our senses in ways that probably have not been demanded of us. So I think as we look at Gebser and contemporary music and art and dance, and look back at Empedocles and Parmenides, as Kingsley is doing, I think we can develop all kinds of resources. Development may not be the right word, because that sounds so much like preparing to take an exam or a test or a pop quiz. It may not be about development at all. We may have to drop all that shit to allow something new to come through. So I think we're in this transition, and whatever assists us, I think, is going to be, has a lot to do with who we're with, and what the concerns and what others care about, and the metaphorical constructs that they are employing. Are we going to enter into a really shitty trance with this person? Or a trance state that's very dysfunctional, you know? The social, the regular consensus reality trance? Or are we going to create a different kind of trance? I believe there are all kinds of trances that we could explore and enjoy and be perplexed by. Sort of like this. Now this to me is extremely weird, but I'm sharing it with you guys anyway, because I think there's something, this I believe is a boundary object. just like those clouds, that Anthony is rhapsodizing about as he gets ready to, call it quits. He's getting ready to suicide in that particular speech. So anyway, illusion and illusion, and ecstasy, and logic, and the performing body. Is there anything else? Someone have something different? Where do you want to go with this?
I would like to let those simmer for a little while, and ask your thoughts, you being Michael or John, uh, on the idea that Kingsley presents at the beginning of this interview, that what we call human is not what was meant by human by these ancient thinkers or ancient seers, and that what we are is not even developed. We're not even sprouted yet. He says that we are like plants, human plants. He says he responds in this interview. Actually, we are seeds, and have not yet become plants. We have not budded yet, have not yet started to open and blossom. We have the potential to become full human beings, but the potential has not been realized. And then he goes on to say that we're unstarted. And this is coming after an observation that he makes. He uses the word developed. He says that when one meets developed human beings, one is struck by their quality of being embodied, and their senses are wide awake. And I don't think I've seen that definition of development anywhere, actually. The definitions of development I've seen from cognitive psychology and developmental theory and integral theory focus on cognition and perspective taking and the capacity for complexity, more and more perspectives, like to the fourth degree, the fifth degree, the nth degree. And I think that what is being pointed to here is it's a different kind of development. We could perhaps say that each sense can develop. We can develop our sense of taste, of hearing, of vision, and that we are doing that. We can do that anywhere. That's what's kind of cool about it, and the practice that Kingsley is suggesting was at the heart of this tradition. It was a spiritual practice that involved developing the senses. And more than that, developing a sort of integration of the senses. He doesn't use that word exactly. He uses the Greek word metis. Metis? I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that. But this metis refers to a sort of presence, as I'm translating it, a presence with what is, what appears.
It's a fluid quality.
That's right. Because what
A
appears
very
is
fluid quality. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Marco.
well, let's flow with it. There's a fluid quality, and there's a still quality. That's
Yeah,
what's that's what's interesting. That's the whole and the whole, the HOLE and the WHOLE coming together. That's the paradox. Paradox, coming from the Greek, means against appearances. So
yes.
it's something that is not what it appears to be. It would appear that everything is moving. Parmenides says everything is still. But that doesn't mean that everything moving is untrue or an illusion.
Yeah.
It's an aspect of the stillness.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't see it or experience it that way, we being mental modern humans. But we could if the seed of that kind of development were to be nurtured. And I think reading poetry allowed the performative body, the imagination, the practice of imagination and integration of sensory experience into wholes,
Hmm.
greater wholes.
Hmm.
I believe, and I'm coming to believe that is this practice. That is the practice of being and becoming. And I wonder about this topic and climate change, to bring it back to what we discussed last week and what has been part of one of the threads in this discussion, is that the there's a kind of mentality that goes along with climate fear that is not still is not rooted in stillness. There isn't that hole in the middle of the donut. There's there's intense anxiety, and there's an intense identification with the with what is changing, but not a sense of where it's changing from or what it might be changing into. And I wonder if if deepening into a stillness and opening, developing the senses could offer a another way of approaching the problem.
So, couple things as far as my reading, and words that come to me are it's an initiate because this is steeped in initiation practice. He uses the word in the book, not so much in the thing, but in the book I read, initiation, that you're initiated. The poetry was purposely also, like you said, an illusion, but it was purposely riddled to challenge, to bring, that's the practice. And there's an incubation of this. And part of the reason, in terms of how I would draw a relationship to climate change, is in my part, and the embodied part is because part of the embodied part is, like, let's just say Dalai Lama, and I also have been in the presence of Thomas Keating. There was an embodied, his presence was emotional as much as intellectual. There was an emotional tone flowing through him that was free. It wasn't about trying to stop it or anything. Even if anger came up, it's there. It's a different relationship to the emotional intensity of being in a liminal space that I apply to climate change. And that stillness, how I take his reading of the stillness and coming to our senses, it's not just thought we have to still, it's thought that has emotion packed into it. That's, there's an emotional component in every fucking thought. And that stillness helps us on a sensory level actually stop being afraid of the intensity that it can feel like. And I'm coming back to Gebser because I love Gebser just pointing out that in these initiations, if you look at what they put you through in the steps, they intensify everything. They bring us to a state of intensity, and learning to rewire, in a way, our nervous system being, there's no judgment, but in interacting in our little small nervous systems going through just life and our parents and everything, our nervous system have these short circuits or whatever of moments of intensity that as a child we didn't know how to deal with, so they were unconsciously, held in our body. Well, some of this practices feels like what I've been working on, of being still enough to let that short circuit show itself so it can just move through me instead of being stuck in me. I mean, that's the way I'm resonant or trying to go alongside what you're saying, Marco.
I totally resonate with that, and I I think the climate crisis is nothing but an intensification. Uh,
Yeah.
and and what's on a practical level, it's horrible.
Hmm.
Millions of people are being displaced. Millions are going to die, maybe more. Uh, and there's a lot of pain
Yeah,
that is coming, is
that's
already
true.
here.
That's true.
And I guess, I mean, when I think about intensification, the pleasure pain uh, polarity, I think, is
Yeah,
part of that. It's an intensification of what? What
good
makes it
point.
intense?
Good point.
And I think that what is intense is it's a quality of feeling.
Yes.
And so when you say thought has feeling in it or an emotion in it, emotional content charge, I think that's totally right. And from a perspective of a meditator, we know that any thought that arises has a corresponding sensation or feeling or expression that's embodied. And we may tend to focus on the cognitive content of the thought, thinking future or past or something somebody said or something I have to do or whatever it is. But what actually the practice is to be with the intensity of the
Hmm.
thought and let it flow, let it
Hmm.
take its course. And there's something about this period in history that is, in a way, is nature taking its course. Uh, it's a logical conclusion in another sense. That might be, I think that where I wanted to go in a sense, it was that there's this death space that we're in, we're coming
Talk
to.
about intense.
Right. And that ending of a tradition, perhaps, ending of a way of being, and potentially also the beginning of something new, but not until we've passed through the crucible
Right.
of time. And I want to also recall a suggestion that Kingsley makes here, which is pretty radical. I don't know what to think of it quite yet, but he claims that our history, our tradition has been seeded. It was intended. It's not just an accident.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if that's the case, then in a way we might imagine that everything we're experiencing by way of climate catastrophe is in a way intended, perhaps, to intensify consciousness. And I wonder what you all think of that.
I love that idea, actually. I think it's a, if we can embrace this, we can embrace just about anything, the Anthropocene. Um, and it's so interesting to me. I mean, I went through a very tragic episode in my youth and in my young adulthood. It dominated my life, actually. The AIDS epidemic destroyed any hope of any conventional happiness. And I saw the best and brightest minds in the gay community wiped out. So the next generation of gay people are going to be deprived of a great deal of wisdom. But I think those of us who survived and are still here have a special obligation, I think, to those who are now our ancestors, to really honor what they went through. And I think this is something that Kingsley points out to, the debt we owe to our ancestors. And we have to, and I think there's a relationship between that, that honoring of the ancestors, what Whitman expresses so beautifully in that poem that I quoted from last time, the Brooklyn Ferry. I think that capacity to register that affective zone, because it's beyond the intellect, for sure. It's beyond anything I can think. I'm going to quote Plotinus. I think he captures something. He talks about the soul's descent into the body. I'm just going to quote the first paragraph to this, the 8th tractate. Many times it has happened, lifted out of the body into myself, becoming external to all other things and self-centered, beholding a marvelous beauty, then ever more than ever, assured of community with the loftiest order, enacting the noblest life, acquiring identity with the divine, stationing within it by having attained that activity, poised above whatsoever within the intellectual is less than the supreme. Yet there comes the moment of descent from intellection to reasoning, and after that sojourn in the divine. I ask myself how it happens that I can now be descending, and how did the soul ever enter into my body, the soul which, even with the body, is the high thing it has shown itself to be. So I'm very curious about, this is a very old idea, the soul, and the relationship between the soul and the subtle body, or what some traditions call the hybrid body. I think Abhigabha Gupta, how do you pronounce that, Marco? You know how to.
Abhinavagupta.
Yeah, I read a book, commentate the Doctrine of Vibration, but I've never learned, I've had a hard time pronouncing this guy's name. But at any rate, he talks about the hybrid body. It's a body that's in between the subtle and the causal. And I think many traditions articulate many different theories, East and West, and North and South, about this, the subtle ranges that many of us can have in meditation and reverie and trance and in creating art or receiving works of art. I believe these subtle ranges are extremely intense. I also had a dream, a lucid dream, where I saw a very beautiful man, and the first thing I got was a very strong erotic charge. And then I went, wait a minute. And I asked him, who are you? And he said, I am you. And I said, how can you be me? And then he walked off a little bit, and I could see others were there. And there was sort of a mind meld among these others. And then he returns to me, almost as if he's an ambassador from this group. And he says, we share the same heart. And I immediately went, oh, I get that. And then I descended from wherever I was to where I am now. It was definitely a feeling of an ascent from a place of great affective and enormous intensity and marvelous beauty. And I think that it left me quite baffled. And I started to realize, slowly but surely, after many, many experiences like this, I remember having a moment in a subtle realm experience, where I looked into a mirror and I saw a figure behind me, and I understood, oh, I'm a double. I get it. This was about 2 years ago. Fortunately, I had a very close friend who's exploring clean language with me, which is the only method I found that can actually work with these visionary episodes. I would never go to a shrink and talk about this stuff. I know I would get diagnosed and given a prescription really fast. But fortunately, I was able to work on this stuff philosophically and spiritually and linguistically. But I found that recently a book by David Stang. He's written a book called Our Divine Double. And I went to the library yesterday, the reading room downtown, to look at it. And I was astonished, absolutely astonished, that right around the time Plotinus was writing, this is after Plato, but it's around the collapse of the Roman Empire, right around that time when it was starting to fall apart. There were a lot of Gnostic thinkers, Christian Gnostics, a lot of Gnostic voices. and the Manichaeans and the Gnostics and a whole range of cults. There was at that time, according to David Stang, an explosion of interest in the double. And there were many persons who are having these visionary episodes. If you look at the findings in the Nag Hammadi library, there's the Gospel of Thomas, where he talks about the twin. And Jesus has a twin. There's some very bizarre passages in that gospel that don't make sense if you don't know about the double, and how this motif is extremely strong. And Plotinus is certainly drawing upon it, as are many of the Gnostics. And as the new Gnostics like myself, I'm having these experiences, and I'm only now beginning to start to connect the dots. But I found this Henry Corbin, who works in the Sufi tradition, I think he coined the term the imaginal. He worked with Jung and definitely was aware of all these Gnostic traditions and the double. I'm just quoting him because this makes so much sense to me, and I hope someone else can help me with this, because I think there is a logic here. Corbin talks about this experience, and this kind of experience that I just described. How can I am you? How can you be me? That quandary, which I think is a lot like this. Okay, this is what Hamdi Corbin says about this mystical experience. This new identity does not correspond to a relationship of 1 equals 1, but of 1 times 1. The identity of the essence raised to its total power by being multiplied by itself and put in a condition to constitute a bi-unity, a dialogic whole whose members share alternately the role of first and second persons. Or again, the state described by mystics when, at the climax, the lover has become the very substance of love. He is then both the lover and the beloved, but himself will not be that without the second person, without the thou, that is to say, without the figure who makes him able to see himself, because it is through his very own eyes that the figure looks at him. It would be wrong to reduce the dimensionality of this dialogic unity to a solipsism, as to divide into 2 essences, each of which could be itself without the other. And I'm reminded of what Paul said about the Christ within. I think that, anyway, I think this is food for thought. And I think there's a kind of paraconsistent logic that Corbin is talking about. One, it's not about 1 equals 1, it's about 1 times 1. That's a whole different, that's a whole different way of thinking about it. Anyway, this may be real simple to some people, but to me it's really very difficult. It's taken me decades to sort this out. And I'm not finished yet, but I have a funny feeling if there were more people who were comfortable with this idea that this is not all there is. I think we would be having much more fun here than we are now. And I love that song. I think I posted Peggy Lee. Is that all there is? Is that all there is? That's all there is, my friend. Then let's keep dancing. Let's break out the blues and have a ball if that's all there is. I think that's such a deep, poignant, narcissistic, nihilistic, lost in a pathologically affluent society that's going nowhere fast. And I think that it's a beautiful song, and I think she does it so well. And she has that wonderful last refrain. She says, "Oh no, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that if it's as bad as you say it is, why don't you just kill yourself?" And she says, "Oh no, I'm not ready for that final disappointment." And I think, but I think that that's not necessary. And I hope that in the Anthropocene, if we can embrace this as an opportunity, it may accelerate these capacities that are, these potentials that are latent in all of us, I believe, to hit the jackpot. We don't have to just be seduced and conform to this gross national product, path dependency, neoliberal trance, corporate derived, corporate sponsored. So anyway, those are my raw thought feels about this. Thanks for this opportunity to go in this direction. Thanks.
In the reality book and what I've been reading, he's describing at the time that he went into the underworld to get these gifts of logic and talk to the goddesses and stuff. And that underworld is not knowing, death, blackness, and that. And when you guys were talking about nihilism last week, and we're talking about it now, I was activated and triggered from my attempted suicide, because I think in that incident, I kind of, fortunately, I was bad at it. I didn't do a good job of taking it to that way, but I think something came out of it that was real interesting, is that the lesson about the intensity that sometimes nihilism doesn't, it makes you, paralyzes you. That the thought of nihilism paralyzes you in the midst of intensity. And so you just, get to that point and you don't feel like you can move or not. And for whatever reason, I was able to push past that and actually take it a step further, which from my understanding, some nihilists do. They just say, I'm out of here. Fuck it. To be or not to be or whatever, that fucking line. But, and I don't totally understand it, John. I just quote it.
I think Hamlet was a deep nihilist. I really do.
Oh, okay.
He's the first modern man. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you guys were talking about it, and I was drawing on my experience with it, it's interesting that took place 34 years ago. I just think, I'm being very grumpy in a way, in the sense that I think nihilism is just an excuse not to really live, not to fully embrace, because you can't have it your way. And that's what led me to my attempted suicide. When I really got through it, shit was happening and it wasn't going my way. And I think that's when I began to outgrow my emotional adolescence. And I think I was initiated from that event. I think all of us are in these. If that's the concept of initiation, has helped me organize my psychic trauma that I've had. And looking at it that way, it just made me realize, oh, okay, I'm back on board with this, but the only thing it changes is it's not gonna take away that there's still loss, because I've suffered a lot of loss of family and friends, but the quality, and this is what Kingsley, when he's talking about going and talking to God and stuff, he's being initiated into a way of participating in the divine that we don't know exist, and he's bringing it back. He's taking the chance and he's bringing it back to us. These cafes, I think, are ripples. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that these cafes and the way I personally interact are ripples that help me just do my best and not worry about the end result, because it's larger than me. At the same time, I'm part of it. That tension of being part and feeling into the infinity of it all, that tension, that's what the suicide helped me. I learned of dealing with that tension that can get intense, that intensification of that tension between the being finite and infinite. But there's a paradox there. If I understand some of our research and stuff, there's a paradox of a way of embracing the tension and intensity, and then actually it helps you relax. You just relax. Doesn't necessarily change a lot other than the way you respond to the shit that happens in a way, you know? And it feels like touching, it's owning my language, owning the spark of the divine that's in you. And that will spread out to others, because I'm not doing this just for myself. I know that now. I got past that. I'm not doing it for myself, because part of my experience with my suicide, the moment of suicide and being in complete darkness, the love of my son brought me back. I couldn't leave my son behind. I had to watch him grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That's dovetails nice with what I wanted to bring in, which is from the latter part of this interview, where Peter Kingsley says that everything in existence is crying out for a particular quality of consciousness that only humans can give. That's a strong claim. I think that some more ecologically minded folks might disagree with that, but he goes on to say that the famous mystic Rudolf Steiner, who we just touched on a bit here, but is part of the lineage, I think, of integral thinkers, practitioners, and visionaries. He said that for the agricultural process to happen, for seeds and plants and trees to grow, birdsong is absolutely essential. I never had that thought before. And this is a beautiful truth that very few people know, but we also need to take what he said one stage further, because birds call and sing not only to quicken the plants, they also call to awaken the human seed that we are. They're actually singing for our sake as well. If we can start to listen to them, really listen, they will draw us into this greater consciousness I have been talking about. They will be our teachers, because outer nature is able to point us to our inner nature. And then he goes on to speak about this sense of service, which I think your song as a parent, as a dad, is part of what I think you need to bring forth. That's what perhaps brought you back to life, is the responsibility of that song. And then he goes on to talk about St. Paul and how he speaks of all creation groaning in travail and pain until now, awaiting the revelation of the children of God. And that's Christian language. But I think the idea is similar to what we might express in any number of terms. And he comments that the mention of groaning is significant. The epidemic of depression sweeping Western culture stems from this pain of the earth. When depression touches us, there is a sense of shame. We want to go away and hide. But really, it's not we as individuals who get depressed, right? That's the illusion of depression, that it's about you as ego. Our depression is creation's depression. And so there is a very fine line where ultimately, if we are able to stay conscious, then even to be depressed can be an act of service.
Yes.
And I think that's an amazing thought. And I've spent a big part of Sunday with a friend of mine who is very depressed, and I took on that. I knew it was not going to be easy to hang out with him,
Yes.
uh, but I did because I love him. And so I wanted to send him this or convey this, that as bad as it seems, uh, that that could be part of a larger story that we're not quite seeing. And
Right.
I think that larger story is a creative story. It's a story of creation. And I know that for me, when I was in the depths of my depression, the thing that brought it out of it was finding, and it was the merest inkling. It was just like a thread of hope, but it was finding the ability to create.
Hmm.
And as long as that thread was alive, as long as I felt something could come of this, some kind of beauty that somebody might
Hmm.
find succor, uh, or benefit from, whether that would be just my family or my friends or the cosmos, uh, that is what brought me out of it. And when I feel pain and unhappy, I think this is I'm going to use it for poetry.
Yeah.
I'm
Yes.
going to
Yeah. Yeah. I just
uh,
listened to Michael Mead give a podcast about chaos, climate, and creation. And it was centered around learning to work with strong emotions because mythologically, he's saying that emotions are about energy and flow, and they're, if we could understand them as messengers rather than these ideas that we've overlaid and about, we usually relate to our, and we talk about this, relate to our emotions through ideas and not actually feel the emotion.
that's right.
And so he's talking about mythologically being, even in troubled times, developing again an emotional sense, intelligence.
And I think that has something to do with the presence and with
Yes.
um, the the difference between the cognitive content of a thought and the affective experience of a thought.
I like the way you distinguish that because that's the way Thomas Keating actually, believe it or not, in one of his books, when he wrote about thought, he included all the senses.
I met Thomas Keating once.
I seen you meet him in that one YouTube.
Well, after that, I got to
Oh,
ask a question in that event, and then
yeah,
afterwards, just milling about, he was going one way and I was going the other, and he was just in front of
great,
me.
great.
And it was really impressive because it was radiance. It was just he was radiating, and it was
Wasn't he? Yeah,
joyful.
yeah,
I just got a hit of joy. It was like
yeah,
like going out from indoors out into the sun, like,
yeah.
and uh, that was the most memorable. Um,
And so, could he be considered one of those spiritual beings that Kingsley talks about?
I would consider him one.
Thank you. Thank you. Because I wonder, to kind of get back on track, that question you asked about spiritual beings. I'm wondering about, without maybe not dissing that, from another planet, but spiritual beings that he's talking about were individuals that were living on this earth that, for whatever reason, had raised their consciousness living amongst other people, you know? Not dismissing the possibility of whatever else, I just go meta so far, I guess.
Well, I want to let John get in, but it does open up another direction, which is because part of what we might need to do, or what I've needed to do too, is get away from other people. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and so there's this play of solitude and sociality that I think has
That's a
some.
good point. That's a
Mm,
good point.
Well, I'm just thinking about children and something and therapy, the world of therapy and um, the vagus nerve and polyvagal theory. I think I posted something on this. One of the thinkers who's come up with this theory of the polyvagal, and I think I've described some of the theory behind it. But I think there's children, it's becoming clear that children have metacognitive capacities at very young age, but that we currently don't know what to do with that, so we promptly ignore it. And then we give them reading, writing, arithmetic as fast as we can. And but I think that as we're starting to think about what happens in the Anthropocene and what skills and abilities and resources will our children need in this really perplexing unknown future, we may need to rethink a lot of this. And what those metacognitive capacities in children, if we stop ignoring that and start giving our attention, then what would happen? And also, as adults, we know we were given a lot of bullshit about the myelination of the neurons happens in childhood, and by the time you're an adolescent, the ones that are myelinated will stay, and everything else will die, and you have no more neurons in your brain. We know now that's not true. I mean, neurons, we can create new neurons, not to mention new connections between the neurons. The brain is enormously, the brain mind is very plastic, neuroplastic. Neuroplasticity is a big theme now, along with epigenetics. I think this is very stimulating because it's how you use your senses and how you use what you do with your brain that shapes your brain. And I think that if we just gave attention to the metacognitive capacities of children, rather than force feed them what we already know how to do, I believe we could be creating a different kind of architecture, not just for individuals, but for collectives to operate in ways we can't even predict right now, because this new mind may not be about prediction and control anymore. It's much more about refining those skills that we already have and adding to them through our curiosity and our various language games. Something that we have no names for yet. This has always been the function of poetry, by the way, is poetry comes from our future. When we come across new poetry, we don't know what the fuck they're talking about. But after a while, you keep absorbing it, and you say, "Oh yeah, and I think I'm starting to get a vibe. I get the rhythm. Something's happening here." And then we get more conversational with these kinds of impacts. And I believe our neurosemantic spaces are evolving very quickly right now in ways that we can't possibly predict or control. And I think that's what's so fascinating about this time and this place that we're in. And if we could start to embrace this Anthropocene rather than sit on our pity pot and sing along with Peggy Lee, is that all there is? I mean, anyway, I really loved everything that you guys have shared, and what you said was so poignant, Michael, about dealing with intensification, paradox. Embracing the intensity helps you relax. And owning the spark of the divine and your love for your son and watching him grow.
And just to use a little clean language, and I'm riffing, so pardon me, the size and shape of my love for my son is the size of the earth from a moonshot.
And the size of the earth from a moonshot.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
And then there's this, on a feeling tone, gravity wave of the two objects interacting.
There's
a gravity field and gravity wave between the two, the moon and the earth.
and a gravity field between the moon and the earth
with waves.
with waves. And with all of that, and the love for your son, and that size and that shape, as big as the earth from a moonshot, did I get that right?
Yes.
And that gravity and that wave. Is there a relationship between all of that and ecstasy?
Fuck yeah. I mean, ecstasy by the very definition is my sense of self it has holes all in it. I mean, it's a different kind of sense of self. It's not solid, but there's holes in it. There's holes that are like Marco says, WHOL, and then there's holes for the energy to come in and out, to flow.
Thank you.
So I still have a sense of self, but it's totally the senses are open. Let's put it that way.
And the thread, Marco, that thread, and you already start to model yourself that thread. I'm just curious about, is there anything else about that thread? And the cognitive and the affective. And being with your friend, your depressed friend, whom you love. And that thread. Is there anything else about that thread?
An image is coming to mind. If you've ever seen time-lapse photography of plants growing or roots growing, they move. They move almost like animals. That's what they look like, and we don't see them without the technology or without paying close attention, without observing. So the technology facilitates that, but they go like this, they squiggle, and they move towards and away from nourishment, away from toxins, poisons, and they have elaborate communication systems and methods of signaling using chemicals, chemistry, and color and shape to communicate with other plants, with others of the same species, and also with insects and with animals. So there's a very elaborate communication system that emerges, but there's this primary movement, and it's to and away, and it's moving towards and it's moving away. I think that movement reappears. That's part of, from the very simplest to the most complex. And that thread is a kind of finding its way. It's a kind of movement and finding its way and going this way and that and sensing. Is this the right direction? What's the feedback? Does it intensify? Is it deaden? Where there's an intensification of some sweetness, some intuition or feeling of sweetness, then the creative tendril moves in that direction. It could be an illusion. It could be a predator who's trying to trick the plant into compromising its defenses in some way. So the metis that Kingsley brings back into the discourse, I think, has something to do with this intuitive movement and this life activity of seeking creation, of bringing forth, and some kind of maturation of an integrative ensemble of capacities. I hope that as we learn through experience, we learn what to move towards and what to move away from, and what is life-giving, what is toxic to life. And it's it's complex because I would want to move away from my friend's depression. I would want to move away from things that are painful. But a kind of metacognition, I think, becomes activated where we can see that there's that duality of pain, pleasure, and of good, bad, of good, evil, uh, is where we can override it and uh, find what needs to be transmuted, find what needs to be healed, and incorporate that into our being. I don't always do that, and that wasn't. It's it's hard. It's hard work. It's
It
work, and
is.
it's a discipline, and it's a path, and it's a practice. I believe, uh, and fortunately, it's well rewarded by the ecstasy. After the laundry, the ecstasy again.
Yeah, I love that line. I love that line. Well, and you actually just described the issue of polarity. And your thread becomes a rhythm, a ribbon that's tied like the
Lemniscate.
yeah, a lemniscate. But for me, where I've been focused is that intersection and the intensity of where they come together. And yeah, it's a practice because sometimes it is wise to move away from toxic people. But I really honor your generosity of maybe meta going beyond to be with your friend to possibly just with your presence having an effect on him in the midst of the depression that can feel toxic from our side.
And maturation of capacity. The maturation of an ensemble of capacities. And towards and away from. And that primary movement. And the squiggles towards and away from. And the color. And the insects and the animals. And pain and pleasure. And overriding that. And knowing what needs to be transmuted. And ecstasy. And I remember, Marco, you and I were at a cafe over in the village a couple of years ago, talking about cosmos and what might happen. And as we were, I think I was drinking coffee. I don't know if you were having coffee or tea. I think my friend Seth came there. He was there too that afternoon. and I riffed with you on clean language. And I remember you talked about being on a boardwalk, I think, with a friend and a boombox when you were a teenager. And there was a feeling of being in love, you said. And ecstasy. And I think there's that ecstasy of a teenage boy with a peer group, and how necessary and important that is for our development. And then there's that maturation of an ensemble of capacities. And now many years later, you can be with a friend who's depressed. And you know about moving away from the toxic and moving towards something that you may not be able to clearly differentiate yet. But that you do have this ensemble of capacities. So I'm just, is there anything else about that ensemble and that maturation? Whereabouts is that? Does it have a size or a shape at maturation? You don't have to answer if you want to, but
I do have an answer that I think I feel it in the human breast, in the breast. I feel it here. This I'm hitting my chest, as you can see. That's where that juncture in the lemniscate, Michael, moving towards, moving away. I think that's if there's an energetic bodily center of it, I think that that's where it is. The gut plays a big role too, but as far as the verticality of the human structure, that's the midpoint.
Yes, yes, yeah.
And so there's some play between, I think the maturation has something to do with that space, becoming more capacious and becoming a ganglion of integration
Hmm.
uh, for the senses and for the mind as well. If if I feel ecstasy or if I feel pain, it seems to resonate from there. There's other kinds of pain and pleasure in the body, or there's
Hmm.
mental anguish and mental despair, but it seems that when those different kinds of forces find a dynamic balance, that it opens the heart. It opens the heart space. So that's I think more on that.
So
go for it.
yeah, go for it, because that dynamic heart space, I'd like to know
That's,
the size and shape and where does it go?
yeah, that's what we're here for. This is what the essence of sponsorship is, I believe.
Well, one thing that I notice is that I've noticed about my own maturation, why not just my own. I'm saying that this is, I think, general somewhat, that, um, oh, I don't know. Oh, the aloneness is a big part of it, actually. And when I spoke earlier about getting away from people
Hmm.
and that moving away and moving towards, it's so noisy, right? And uh, there's so many, I think you put it earlier, John, extraneous energies. Uh, I have felt often that I need a separate space to grow, that I cannot grow in that kind of environment. And if you think about a plant too, it needs some space. It needs a little bit of, um, it needs to be able to hmm, find itself, be itself. Uh, and I think we live in a very predatory culture. I think that that's part of what, although it's not often, it's not totally spoken. I mean, it's coming to light. It's coming out now. The Me Too movement, for example, uh, and the whistleblower uh, type, phenomena. Uh, so we have to go underground. I think a lot of times to grow, we have to find safe spaces to grow, but not just to hide from those realities. I think to develop strength and capacity to be able to come back and face those realities and transform them, transmute them in whatever ways we can. Uh, so I believe that there is a value to retreat. There is a value to withdrawal. There is a value to defense and defense mechanisms. There's a purpose to them, uh, if they're creating the conditions where our souls can grow, where our hearts can develop those capacious uh, means of working with complexity, working with difficulty, working with evil, and with um, predatory. I mean, evil is just perhaps another word for a predatory type of being that is wants to live at your own expense. Um, so I feel that culturally there's been, I think in Cosmos too, a sense of being, and we even call it the underground. I think it's a place for growth and maturation, but we're not meant to stay underground. We're not meant to stay in the underworld forever. I believe we're meant to emerge from the shadows and from the dark into, John, I think you put it, riffing on something I said, which was riffing on something else, a sunshine society. I think we can move towards the sunshine just as our roots also move into the earth. And I hope that our civilization could mature into a sunshine society. I hope it's not just individuals and small pockets of people. I hope that it can become a viral type of movement.
I think the metaphor of the underground, I find very compelling, very attractive. But I think what's happening now, and I've been a member of many undergrounds. That's the only way we could have survived, was underground. I mean that literally. There was a door. I won't tell you what street it was. There was a door, and there was a sign on it. And we knew what that door was. We knew where it was. When you opened it, there was a stairway, and it went down below. And there was an underground. It was a labyrinth, maze, and the men who were like themselves. We gathered there, and we did all kinds of things, unspeakable things, except I've spoken about it. I wrote a short story, and Marco published it. So now, I think what's happening now is an open underground. You know, we're going to post this on YouTube. I mean, how open can you get? And I think that if we can establish a local coherence, as Bonnie mentions in the interview on Rebel Wisdom, that then that local coherence, we don't have to worry so much about whether it scales up or not. We just have to go back into the world, and we will get feedback. And I think that's, and then what we do with that feedback is indeterminate. And perhaps each of us has to work with that paradox the best way that we can, all the paradoxes and different levels, and the maturational process is going at different speeds for each of us. Some of us are moving very, very fast. Some of us are moving very, very slow. Some of us are moving very, very fast and very, very slow. I would consider myself one of those. I'm a tortoise and a hare. But I think that absolutely, we're not just trying to create silos. You know, there's your ivory tower version of the underground. More disconnected than ever. So I'm really do believe that sunshine society could be something that we could move towards, and we can move away from the toxicity and deal with the bad news in more creative ways than if we just shut down or hunker down or grab that bottle of scotch and turn out the lights and wait till the dawn and listening to Peggy Lee singing "Is That All There Is?" I think we're really, that glamorous kind of narcissism is widely rewarded in our society, and I think we should question it. You know, it's so easy because it can be so attractive and glamorous and punk rock and all of that, you know, and rock and roll and, you know, all the horror movies. I mean, it can be an attractor, and I see some beauty in it. I'm not knocking it. I think there was a great deal of beauty in a lot of that, a lot of Gnostic voices. At any rate, I probably have gone on too long, but I think that there's I don't know how to do this. I don't know how any of us, how we're going to do this. But I think that as we look at these, I'm very drawn to language and discourse, and raising the quality of our discourse has been a mission for myself, and I think some of you are drawn to that as well. And I do believe that we are a microcosm of the macrocosm. So if we, just by coming together and opening up the possibilities of languaging in ways that, head and heart, and this, all this stuff, and this, and our knowing what we know about our neuroplasticity, and this media, and this new medium that we're working in. I believe that, what is it that Bonnie, new things are possible. I think Bonnie said a very interesting, something about what are the possibilities now that had never been possible before. I think there's a lot going on. It's never been possible before. And I think that does help transmute some of the great grief that I have felt personally by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And I think it's the danger to personalize all of that and think it's just about me. Obviously, many others, both human and non-human, we working together to create these conditions for our flourishing with the condition, with the Anthropocene, which we're at the beginning of. So I just think that the fact that we show up consistently has been great, and hopefully we'll find new themes and motifs that can be attractors moving towards that sunshine society, and that just a little bit of wiggles, those wiggles and those squiggles, in the gestures that we give our attention to collectively, and finding a location in our performing bodies for these affects. I think that we're changing. The whole system is going to respond. It's not because of this nature of how we're set up. So I think that reading Kinsley as a strange kind of guy as he is, I think he is very weird, and I like weird. I like the weird and strange, and I think he does that really well. I think he sort of acknowledges that about himself, and I like that oracular voice. And I love Greta Thunberg and her bright energy, and I do think there's a connection between what Kinsey is working with and Greta. I think they're both pointing to this. They're both whistleblowers in a way about how we're getting seduced by the cultural narcissism and nihilism. But I do want to just add something Tim Morton says, that you can't, if you fight nihilism, the nihilism gets stronger. You have to find a way of going through the nihilism. And I think that's the big challenge, rather than hunkering down and trying to put up a fight with these dark forces. Although sometimes that's appropriate, I think it's much more. Maybe if we can just tune in to those cracks, and those interfaces, and those what's happening between the senses, and it's very subtle. You can train your attention, and I believe we all have that meta capacity to train our attention as we move from the visual to the auditory, to the kinesthetic, to the touch and smells, and to the imagined senses. I mean, we also, we close our eyes and go to sleep at night. There are towns and there's cities and there's sun and moon and light and dark. And where does that come from? I think that, so it's that interplay, I think, of the inner senses and the so-called outer. I believe it's much more fluid and dynamic than we currently are able to work with. And I think this is what I think the mystery of the senses. I think it's a great thing to study together. Wherever you're doing this, and I think Kinsley is just another practitioner, you know, and he's, I think, creating something that's very useful. And I'm looking forward to reading Reality. I also want to read his recent book called Catalafugu. I can't pronounce the word. He's written a 2-volume study on Jung, Carl Jung. But anyway, I think that he's someone else we could just add to the list of practitioners and thinkers that are stimulating our imaginations. So.
Yeah, I just because of you, John, actually, and listening to you, one of the things I was stimulated metaphorically, because I've been involved with with Alan Watts specifically, of his deep connection with Taoism and their metaphors of nature and flowing like water. And I agree with you. We need to lower the resistance and navigate. And that means you're not ignoring it. You're not trying to get away from it. You're actually turning towards the wind, turning towards it to navigate the resistance in an intelligent way, you know. And I think that's part of what I like about what you emphasize and why I'm interested in language, because just rephrasing it sometimes, or paying attention to a metaphor, changes the way I behave with it.
That's right.
And it reshapes us. Excuse me. And I'm finding that sensitivity, that value, that we are telepathically connected. We just have on a proportional level, we don't have enough people understanding that. I'm a little bit wondering, because anything can be used for nefarious purposes, not just for good. So we can have these acknowledgments and there can still be evil in the grass, you know, kind of thing. But if I've honed my sensitivity and be aware of that, even when that evil shows up, I respond from a certain place. I don't. I can respond in a way to defend myself without even trying. I don't even have to try. I can still defend myself and feel good about it, you know? And I have one other metaphor that I was thinking about and listening, is sometimes, other than being with you guys on this Skype, when I go out there, I actually hide in plain sight. I fucking don't want the notoriety of, you know, I'm very subdued out there, because like both of you have said, you know, I don't mind being around people, but I have this working force field if I have to go out, you know, and it's based on a kindness from the heart. You know, it's not a defensiveness, but it's a reality I have to use of being around people that just are at different maturation places. It's a reality. Speaking of reality,
It goes both ways too. I mean,
yeah.
You know, you can I've encountered greater beings, or what from my perspective might be a greater being, and you almost want to hide from that too, because because partly because you're so exposed, you're so transparent to them,
right?
You feel that way,
Yeah.
And so, but I don't want to make that a virtue. I just want to note that I think that it's part of the flow, and it's part of the squiggling
Exactly.
is the ebb and flow of withdrawal or contraction and
Hmm.
expansion and
Right.
exploration. And we may, I think, sometimes tend to want to valorize one or the other and say expansion is
Yeah.
good,
Yeah.
contraction is
Yeah.
bad,
Right. Right.
openness is good, but closure is bad.
Yeah.
Uh,
No.
However, I think it's really situational, and that's
Hmm.
why the abstractions and the rules don't work. It's something that has to be sensed in the moment, in
Right.
the act, in the situation that one is in. Uh, and before we close, because we're I know near the end, uh, I want to highlight some another point from this interview where Kingsley's talking about Empedocles, and who says that we don't use our senses, but instead are used by them. He says quite specifically, we are dragged along by them, but that the art is how to use them rather than be used by them. And this
Yes.
requires very subtle changes in our consciousness, where instead of letting the senses just bombard us with data that carry us along, we actually turn our attention. And this was, I underlined this, and I have I'm, it doesn't totally make sense to me. I'm curious about it, and maybe we'll come back to it in another talk. But we actually turn our attention back to face what is coming back to face what is coming towards us.
Hmm.
And that brought to mind a point that Ed Mahood has raised before about the word repentance and the etymological root of repentance being to turn around.
Hmm.
And that on the one hand, it can be turned around from a path that you are on. It could also be spinning around, turning around, looking
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
And I um, I think it also has to do with what is coming towards us in the sense of the future.
Hmm.
And I want to also ask and seed a future conversation about the senses, because we've assumed that there are five senses: taste,
There's
touch,
not.
hearing, smell, right? Uh, I've just begun to explore a little bit about some other ways of thinking about that, where there might be 20 or 30 senses rather than just five.
Easily, easily.
Okay. Then I think that would be an interesting thing to explore in a future cafe. And I also note that we have a whole list of other topics that came out of that have been generated over the last couple of years, and John made a list of some of them. And I thought it was good how last week we didn't have one on Thursday, but by the weekend we had a topic for the next week. So perhaps that's a better deadline.
Well, I
And
think if we could just brainstorm a little bit right now and about what we might learn today about reflexivity as a group and local coherence and coherence as an individual and solitude and aloneness may be necessary for that so you can clear your system of all the mishigas of all the others around you. Also, entering into that local coherence as a we is something is extremely precious and very fragile, and it could be easily disrupted by by one person who uses a Facebook strategy. So I think I've been hyper vigilant in um, paying attention to tones and affects and different kinds of messages, and the analog and the digital. And I'm pleased to say that I believe that in the 2 years that I participated in the cafe, we've had lots of ups and downs, but I think that we're developing a kind of group reflexivity. So we're not just thinking about me, Marco, or Michael thinking about Michael, or Marco thinking about Marco, but we're thinking about a we space and what stories, metaphors that are being generated can be most useful for this we space, rather than what can I get out of this group that's good for me. That kind of that's very deeply installed in us at a very early age. And so I believe the more and more we're able to recognize that tendency, the more and more we can sort of self-correct for it. Anyway, I think we're doing that. I think it's great. I think I would love to nominate Benita Roy's presentation on 6 ways of going meta. I can post it. There's a conversation, about an hour-long interview with her, where she talks about her model, and then there's a link to her presentation of the model. And I think it's also Jeremy, when we had a conversation with him, he mentioned this particular event, which occurred, I think, in July. So it's still very fresh. It's a deep dive. It's very nerdy. It's really a lot about developmental theory and what happens after developmental theory. And I've been drawing upon that conversation that she had. Some of my comments today. So anyway, that's something that I would like to put on the table as a possibility, if not for next week, sometime in the future. But I think we're still evolving what this cafe could be, what it has been, what it could become. But I think it should be short and sweet stuff. I don't think we should be doing books. I think books should be a study group. And I think that I think if we take an essay, or like we did today, an interview, and you know, a YouTube presentation, whatever, I think we can do that. Our homework could be no longer than an hour and a half.
I agree, John. I agree.
And then we can do something next Tuesday, and we can prepare. We can prepare. You know, we can muse upon something over the weekend and think about it, and we can change the direction of it if we want to, if we have a direction. But I just don't. To me, I think it's, and I think, and for those who want to do an open frame where you just get together and shoot the breeze, I'm all for that too. I think we should have a healthy balance between go-getters like myself who want something to happen, and, you know, those who just want to be open and discover and, you know, just explore. I think that I love techniques. I love methods. You know, I love models. That's what gives me, I have a great deal of interest in that. And meta modeling. I like to model about models. Take this one, this one, this one. What's in between all these different models. So anyway, that's my spiel. And so I will post this Vanita Roy presentation, and hopefully someone else will be interested in it too. Thanks.
Well, I really like the way this went down, as far as, you know, Thursday, and then, you know, it was put out there and was open,
Yeah.
suggestions, and then, you know, I made it, you know, I just like the flow of it, and it was still flexible to see what happens. I like the exchange, the way you guys answered Lucy's question of how she didn't see where it connected. And although my first response is, why don't you see it? You know, come on, it makes sense to me.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. But I like the way both of you, you know, responded to her question. It really flowed nice. I'm stealing a title from a book for a cafe in terms of senses, Marco, called "Your Body Is Your Brain."
That's cool. That's
as you know, as far as, you know, maybe just flipping this whole top, you know, and it just feels like it flips the metaphor of brain body disconnect. I stole it from a book that is very much about semantic, the brain, and how much semantic intelligence informs the brain.
I love that. I love that.
Me too.
I love that. And I want to bridge the gap between therapy world and trauma and evolution.
Good, John.
I want to take from the therapy world, what can we evolve out of that? Because I think we have to think beyond repair. And I think so much of therapy, and I studied to be a therapist, was just about fixing people who were broken now.
Go repair, and because of emotional support, literally transmuting whatever damage has happened. You transmute it, but you have to have some grounding and understanding that alchemical process. You do have to have some grounding. You got to know the tools to work with.
That's right. That's right. And I think it'd be fun to like explore some techniques, some safe techniques for working with guilt and grief, which I think is epidemic right now. And it could really And like I said, ending up in the fetal position in the corner of your bedroom isn't going to help the polar bears,
No.
And I think we have to find a way of oscillating, as I think that's a term that we're all familiar with.
Right.
Working with this cognitively and affectively, and with the gut, and balancing these different intelligences.
Well, and I think a new kind of twist on the thing is, you've critiqued it. We spend a lot of time sitting on the cushion, developing the witness on the cushion. Yeah. Well, now there's another maturation of that witness plus a social witnessing.
That's
early social witnessing of what's going on. And like Michael Mead in that podcast was describing why wouldn't we get emotional when the polar bears are dying, or when you make comments about the bird, or whatever's going in the rest of the world, we're going to feel the effect. His point was, but we have to develop skills of how to respond.
That's right.
And not demonize the emotion, because this whole thing was, we got to stop relating to emotions through ideas and learn, and I think initiate ourselves in better ways of relating to them, because they're telling us something, and it's nonverbal.
That's right. And it enhances our coherence.
Oh yes, exactly. That's one of the points he made. They're there to actually create.
Blessings on all of you. I love the conversation. Thank you.
Scott, I love the conversation too. I like the fact it started off with me and Marco, you, and then all three of us. That was a nice come around.
We braided.
That's right.
Nice come around.
Nice.
That's
all
right.
Have a beautiful day, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you next time.